Thank you, Mary.
Welcome.
On our way down the hall. Good afternoon, everyone. Now let's try it again. Good afternoon, everyone. Much better. This is a university after all. I believe in call and response, so we keeps the neurons going, right? Okay. As Provost and Chief Academic Officer of this university, it's really my pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's plenary session. The session on this conference, or this conversation on child homelessness and child development. Our plenary speaker is eminently qualified to speak to the issues surrounding the use of science and practice to protect and nurture the well-being of children, which is the title of this plenary session. After completing an undergraduate degree at Cornell University, he earned a medical degree at NYU School of Medicine. He further received pediatric training at the Bronx Municipal Hospital Center and the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. In addition, he was on fellowship in the developmental pediatrics at Harvard Medical School and the Children's Hospital in Boston. Today's speaker has received numerous honors, some of which are listed in your program, and I refer you to the program to see all of the various honors that he's received. His publication record is nothing short of remarkable, having authored more than 150 publications, including 9 books, and editing 2 editions of the widely heralded Handbook on Early Childhood Intervention. Furthermore, he has served on the editorial boards of several scholarly journals, most notably the journal Child Development. Our guest speaker is highly sought after for service on national bodies focused on child development and public policy on the welfare of children. In fact, he currently serves as chair of the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child, a body comprised of scholars in different fields of neuroscience, psychology, pediatrics, and economics. His presentation this afternoon is a retrospective on the watershed report he co-authored as chair of a Blue Ribbon Committee of the National Academy of Sciences, entitled From Neurons to Neighborhoods, the Science of Early Childhood Development. The charge of the committee, that Blue Ribbon Committee, was, and I quote, to update scientific knowledge about the nature of early development and the role of early experiences, to disentangle such knowledge from erroneous popular beliefs or misunderstandings, and to discuss the implications of this knowledge base for early childhood policy, practice, professional development, and research. The person you've been waiting to hear is currently the Julius B. Richard Family Professor of Child Health and Development at the Harvard School of Public Health and the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shonkoff.
Thank you. This is working, right? So thanks very much for that very gracious introduction.
You deserve it.
And it's great to be here with you, kind of in the neighborhood. And let me tell you a little bit what I'm going to do in the allotted time before we go on to a discussion. I'm going to ask. I normally don't get up and promote Neurons to Neighborhoods, but I've been asked to do a retrospective on what's happened in the 11 years since that report was released, and to speak a little bit actually to my favorite topic, which is not so much looking back, but looking forward as to where things are going, and to put this in a context or look at it through a lens related to homelessness for young children. But I guess the one thing I'd say from the beginning is that there isn't a different science for children who are homeless, nor is there a different science for children with disabilities or children who live in a wide range of circumstances. There's one science of human development, but obviously it plays out very differently. And so we'll use a homeless lens here, but pretty much everything I'm going to say applies to all children. So for starters, Nearest Neighborhoods was released in October of 2000, and as the provost mentioned, our task, and I'm standing on the shoulders of an extraordinary committee that worked for 2.5 years on this report, was to basically put together what we knew as of September of 2000, before the report came out in October, from a wide range of disciplines, from the behavioral and social sciences, including the biological sciences. And there were 4 major themes that were articulated in the report, and I've divided those themes into 2 categories. So the first are 2 themes that have really stood up well over time, and are as relevant today as they were 10 years, 11 years ago. The first is that all children are born, actually this has lost, it changed its font, it lost its color. Well, we'll see what happens with some of these. So the first is that all children are born ready to learn and wired for feelings. This rhetoric in the policy arena about preparing children to learn and be ready to come to school is missing the boat. I mean, children are wired to learn. They're born ready to learn. We don't have to teach children to be motivated to learn. Sometimes we do a lot to make it very hard for that natural instinct to come forward, but it's something that's really there from the beginning. And the second issue is that early environments matter. They matter a great deal. And the active ingredient in the environment that influences development is the quality of the relationships that children have with the important people in their lives. It obviously begins in the family, but it is not restricted to their family. It includes neighbors and other adults who come in contact with young children, including people who work in early care and education programs. In many cases spend as much, if not more, waking hours with children as their family members do. And this was not, the year 2000 was not the first time that this brilliant statement was made. I mean, people knew that, but what was important about the report was that it came out with the imprimatur of the National Academy of Sciences and the Institute of Medicine. And this, my experience has been since the report came out that part of what the early childhood field benefited from and appreciated was not that yet another report came out, but that a body as distinguished as the National Academy of Sciences said, there's a real science here. This is not just, just feeling good about kids and let's be nice to them, that there's a real science behind it. Now, these are 2 of the 4 major themes articulated in the report that still have won well over time, but the other 2 themes, they remain as relevant now as they were before, but these are 2 themes that have become even more increasingly urgent as kind of unaddressed issues. So this was 11 years ago that we said that society was changing and the needs of young children were not being addressed. So fast forward 11 years later, to say that society is changing is an understatement, and to say that the needs of young children aren't being met is kind of a gross oversimplification of a very complicated situation. And just one thing I'll say parenthetically. So remember, this report came out at the turn of the century, right? All this rhetoric about the new millennium and the kind of the beginning of the 21st century. And there were lots of concerns about stresses on families and a lot of concerns about this kind of looming vision on the horizon of how the nature of work was changing and the economy was becoming more globalized, and the need for building a strong educational base and the need for each society to think about its human capital was getting more and more attention. It's been a large part of what's fueled the increased interest in education and investment in education in this country and around the world, as if the moral imperative weren't enough. But for some people, this is a matter of economic competitiveness and survival. Well, in the year 2000, we were kind of already entering a new era where one of the standard measures of effectiveness of early childhood policies was already an anachronism in the year 2000, which is this idea of increasing the rate of high school graduation. That kind of still remains one of the important benchmarks of measuring the effects of programs that were studied over a long period of time. Well, by the year 2000 already it was becoming clear that unlike 10 years before that, when a high school diploma could get you a job that would support a family, that's just history. So it's kind of, this better than I do. It's pathetic that we're still talking about increasing high school graduation rates when a high school diploma will guarantee you either unemployment or a poverty wage job in the economy in this country. So there's a huge way to go on that. And still we're not addressing a lot of the needs that young children have. And one could argue that we're falling further behind. The second issue was that this is a softball giveaway. This will always be an unmet challenge, the relationship between science, policy, and practice. It's always complicated. It will never be easy. But the issue that we really tried to draw attention to before, and that I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about this afternoon, is that there obviously is a natural convergence of a knowledge base, a scientific knowledge base about human development, both on the learning side and on the health side, and on what one might do in the form of practice and policies that steer resources toward practice, to take the knowledge and use it to promote better outcomes, and particularly, from my point of view, reducing the disparities in outcomes in learning and in physical and mental health and in kind of economic well-being that are predictably related to demographic features like social class and race and ethnicity, institutionalized discrimination, early experiences of maltreatment, all of which are very powerful predictors of the greater likelihood for not doing as well academically and having more health problems, and by the way, not living as long. So what I'm going to now spend the rest of the session talking about so much for my looking back. Because I'll tell you, to me, my colleagues and I crossed the threshold a couple of years ago until, I'd say 2 years ago, and then I started to get the courage to say the kinds of things that I'm going to say without flinching this afternoon, is that we really used From Neurons to Neighborhoods as a platform to educate the policymakers and civic leaders and decision makers in this country about the science, to answer the why question of why should we be investing more in young children? Why are the early years important? Why should we care? Whether we care from a moral point of view, moral responsibility, which to me is enough, but again, there was a much larger tent here. For those who are concerned about social and economic investment, the science was very powerful. So in retrospect, that was low-hanging fruit. All you have to do is get an audience of people and explain to them, not politicize it, not get into a harangue about whether taxes should go up or down and what kind of programs should be funded, but just explain to people what we know about the science of human development and the impact of early experience. It's a slam dunk. People get it pretty quickly. And so the why question was easy. And a couple of years ago, partly because of the success in answering the why question, particularly in areas that previously were not interested in investing in young children, you get people who say, you know, I get it. I hear what you're saying. What should we do? Where should we put our money? And that's a harder question to answer. So I started to get nervous about whether the early childhood field, which I had grown up with, would feel threatened by a statement that says, you know, we know that we make a difference in many cases, but we also know that we don't make a big enough difference. And in some cases, we're not making a dent on problems that overwhelm the challenges that we're facing. And we need to start asking and answering the question of what's next. What are we going to do on top of the things we're doing right now? There is no more blood to be squeezed out of the pain that we're still doing. I mean, it's gone as far as it can go. Assuming most of you are familiar with the Credit Research Project. But I'll generalize it and say that we've been studying for now literally almost half a century since the Great Society programs. Lyndon Johnson, the presidency, when Head Start and neighborhood health centers and food programs were invented. And for half a century, we've been doing variations on a theme with a science base that still holds up well. And there's a lot of variability in what we do, but we haven't reached the promised land. So what we've started to do, and now I'm comfortable saying this publicly because people who work in programs are the first ones to say, absolutely, right on. We need new ideas. We need to build on the best of what we do. We should be proud of what this field has accomplished, but we need to do better. And what I'm going to suggest here is that science has more to offer than ideology and advocacy right now about what to do next. Advocacy has taken us very far, but the question is not how do we get more money for programs, or what are we going to do 10 years from now. And particularly for an audience like this, God help us if 10 or 20 years from now, we're doing the same things we're doing today. Nothing new to say. That would be a sign of a weak field, not a field that says we want to do that. So what I'm going to do, and we've honed this down, I'm going to show you 2 brief animations. I used to ask for an hour to give an overview of the science of neuroscience, and now I can show it now 1 minute and 15 seconds with animation attached to it. So this first video, and actually we worked on this. This is out of our National Scientific Council. This video, which runs a little over a minute, has taken over 2 years to produce, because this went through a more rigorous peer review process than any scientific paper that's published in a journal. We went through this not only with the people who do the animations and the people who do the video, but a very tough science group that would not give up until the animations. People said this is very accurate, and it's exactly right. So this is not a pitch to appeal to anything other than a way to illustrate what the science shows. So the first is this is the overview of how normal brain development happens and how experience affects that.
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing the foundation for more complex circuits to build on later. Through this process, neurons form strong circuits and connections for emotions, motor skills, behavioral control, logic, language, and memory during the early critical period of development. With repeated use, these circuits become more efficient and connect to other areas of the brain more rapidly. While they originate in specific areas of the brain, the circuits are interconnected. You can't have one type of skill without the others to support it. Like building a house, everything is connected, and what comes first forms a foundation for all that comes later.
So brain development begins before birth. It continues throughout life, but a huge amount of it happens in the early years. It's a sequential process. Simple circuits are built first for simple skills, and more complex circuits on top of that. When circuits are built is genetically determined, but how they get built, how they're shaped, is heavily influenced by experience. Mostly the quality of interactions, this kind of back and forth, what we call serve and return, what in universities we call contingent reciprocity, the kind of interactions between children and the adults who care for them. Now, the one principle that I want to highlight more intently here, which is critically important for thinking about early experiences and their impact over the life course, is referring to something that we call plasticity, or the flexibility or adaptability of the brain. So the brain, when it's immature and when it hasn't made most of its circuitry, it's optimally flexible and plastic. You can see over time, it's somewhat depressing for people to look at. You can see it as a steep drop in terms of the flexibility or adaptability of the architecture of the brain. So the bad news is that the brain loses its adaptability fairly rapidly as you move from childhood and beyond. The good news is, well, this only goes up to age 70 because of opportunities. If it went up to 110 or 120, the good news is it never gets to 0. So there's no such thing as not being able to adapt and learn new things. It's more difficult. It's hard. This is why we make the same New Year's resolutions every year, which is coming up pretty soon. The flip side of this is that the effort required to make adaptations and to adjust and to take on new challenges increases as the flexibility and plasticity of the brain decreases. This graph is representing literally physiological efforts. So as the brain becomes less plastic, it literally requires more glucose and oxygen utilization for the metabolism of the brain to adapt and to shift and to make adjustments. If we extrapolate this to a different set of energy costs to the brain, or metabolic costs, financial costs to society, the less flexible and plastic the brain is, the more it costs to remediate. So, you know, aggressive behavior in a 2-year-old, some of you may be involved in programs dealing with children in that age period. It's not easy to deal with an aggressive 2-year-old, but it's a piece of cake relative to an aggressive 12-year-old. An aggressive 12-year-old is a lot easier to turn around than an aggressive, out-of-control 22-year-old. And that's not because of stubbornness or motivation. It's because of the fact that the brain gets set in its patterns, and it's literally harder for the brain to shift and to change these kinds of patterns. They get pretty well ingrained. Now, so up until now, this is your crash course in basic principles of neuroscience, telling you what we know about the normal process of brain development, how the architecture gets built, how the brain develops areas of specialization, but they're all interconnected. The next video is your 1-minute course in what happens when things go wrong. Oops. Let me lose that. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to show you some data first. Okay, very quickly. We're in a university. I'm going to show you some data. Right? So, first I'm going to show you data and then the animation. These data are going to be, that I'm going to show you were taken from a study done of children in the child welfare system across the country. 50 state systems, about 1,100 children, all active cases in the Child Protective Services Department. The horizontal axis was looking at the number of risk factors in the child's life in addition to abuse and or neglect, which was common for all. So this would include limited parent education, family mental illness, particularly depression, homelessness, low income, substance abuse, exposure to violence. And the vertical x-axis is the likelihood of a child failing a developmental test at age 3. And what we get is a pattern that is a universal pattern in anything we've ever studied related to risk factors in development. As the number of risk factors increases, the likelihood of a poor outcome increases. You see this for IQ, you see this for academic achievement scores, you see this with a variety, almost any developmental parameter you measure, such that by the time you get to 6 or 7 risk factors in this national sample, essentially all of the children, 90 to 100%, are failing the developmental test at age 3. And this is not just emotional and social problems, these are actually largely cognitive and language delays, all of which make the children in just about every state eligible for special education. And this is not genetically determined. This is the impact of the pileup of adversity. In a couple of minutes I'll show you what's going on in the brain. So these data, this is a representation of EEG data in children who were studied in a study that many of you are familiar with, done in the orphanages in Bucharest, Romania, where an experiment was set up. There was no alternative to institutionalization. Children were given up by their families for orphanages. There was no foster care system in the country. There was no adequate provisions for adoption, and so children were basically in these institutions from infancy until they grew up. And an option for taking some children out of the center and putting them in what was created for this study, a foster care option that didn't otherwise exist. And there was a comparison of many behavioral and neurological parameters. In this case, these are EEG measures represented pictorially, looking at the relationship between children who grew up in homes experiencing positive relationships or in foster care, compared to children who grew up from infancy in an orphanage and never left. To help you interpret this, the deeper the orange, the higher the voltage. This is a representation of brain waves, EEGs. The interpretation is living in an orphanage setting resulted in the equivalent of having like a 25-watt bulb in your brain instead of a 100-watt bulb in your brain. Literally less electrical energy generated by the circuitry and the impulses moving through the brain. Now, this is I think, some kind of really powerful, one study of what is an example of a very rapidly growing and powerful literature to say that early childhood policy and intervention, which is essentially an education policy focused on school readiness, with a token acknowledgement that the kids ought to have health care, is that this is as much about lifelong health as it is about lifelong health. So in this case, these are data taken from a study in New Zealand, a city called Dunedin, where there was in a given year, there was a birth cohort, about 1,100 individuals all born that year have been followed prospectively from pregnancy, and now these data are aged 32 years follow-up. This case was measuring blood levels of a substance called C-reactive protein. This is an inflammatory marker in the blood that has been associated with a higher risk of heart disease. It's been multiple studies to show that there's an increased risk of cardiovascular disease if you have an elevated C-reactive protein. In this population, the entire population born in a given year in Dunedin, about 15% of the healthy, normal 32-year-olds who have normal developmental histories and normal life experiences, by normal I mean positive, about 50% of them had elevated C-reactive proteins, which means there's some statistical greater risk for heart disease later. 32 years old, it's too early to have your first heart attack, so it's just a marker. Of those who had a clinical diagnosis of depression at age 32, there was a much higher, 25% of them had elevated C-reactive proteins. This is consistent with other studies that have shown that individuals with depression have elevated inflammatory markers in their blood. There's an inflammatory component to the condition of clinical depression. So here was the big, exciting finding that had never been reported before. Individuals at age 32 who had a documented history of having been maltreated as young children, this is not remembering, this was documented prospectively from birth. Over 30% of those individuals who were maltreated as children had elevated C-reactive proteins when they were 32 years old. And those who were maltreated and had depression had even higher C-reactive proteins. This is part of what is now a rapidly growing literature that is demonstrating evidence of biomarkers, in this case inflammatory markers, that show the residua of early adversity. So this is, if you will, a biological memory of having been maltreated as a child. So whether the maltreatment occurred at an age that was too young for children to really consciously remember anyway, or whether there's repression of memories, the message here is the body doesn't forget, that there are physiological changes that happen early on as a result of significant adversity that continue into adult life. And this is now where we get to the frontier of where there's a lot still to be understood in basic biological research. But we have known for over 100 years in virtually every country in the world that individuals who grow up in poverty experience significant exposure to violence, maltreatment, adversity, have a much higher prevalence of a wide range of diseases, and don't live as long. And it has nothing to do with access to health care because it's the same pattern and systems, but there's universal health care and everybody gets it. So there's something about adversity that creates physiological changes in the body that not only affects brain development and learning, but also affects physical and mental health. So the question is, what's going on? So here's our 1-minute video on understanding what is actually happening inside the body when children experience significant adversity. So that, as I say, run the tape.
Learning to deal with stress is an important part of healthy development. When experiencing stress, the stress response system is activated. The body and brain go on alert. There's an adrenaline rush, increased heart rate, and an increase in stress hormone levels. When the stress is relieved after a short time, or a young child receives support from caring adults, the stress response winds down and the body quickly returns to normal. In severe situations, such as ongoing abuse and neglect, where there is no caring adult to act as a buffer against the stress response stays activated. Even when there is no apparent physical harm, the extended absence of response from adults can activate the stress response system. Constant activation of the stress response overloads developing systems with serious lifelong consequences for the child. This is known as toxic stress. Over time, this results in a stress response system set permanently on high alert. In the areas of the brain dedicated to learning and reasoning, the neural connections that comprise brain architecture are weaker and fewer in number. Science shows that the prolonged activation of stress hormones in early childhood can actually reduce neural connections in these important areas of the brain at just the time when they should be growing new ones. Toxic stress can be avoided if we ensure that the environments in which children grow and develop are nurturing, stable, and engaging.
So just to clarify here, this is not intended to say that every child is homeless or every child in a poor, growing up in a low-income environment or violence-ridden environment has damage to brain circuits. It's not true in every case. And in fact, let me tell you, there's both a real kind of wake-up call, an ominous wake-up call here, and there's a very hopeful part of this story. So let me kind of explain that. It gets to the issue of being clear about what we mean by stress and what we mean by the stress response. So for starters, when I talk about stress from now to the end of the session, I'm not talking about the cause of stress. So I'm not talking about poverty or violence or homelessness or anything else that might be stressful. I'm talking about the physiological response in the body to stress. And everybody here knows what stress feels like. Okay, so, and everybody knows what the physical sensation of stress feels like. So for like 2 seconds, think back to a time you have been extraordinarily stressed, and you know what that feels like physically. And whether you feel it in the back of your neck or in your lower back or in the pit of your stomach, or wherever it feels, you know that this is not just a thought. There's a physical feeling associated with it. And what you're experiencing is your stress response system in action. Your heart rate is up, your blood pressure is up, stress hormone levels are increased in your blood sugar level is increased, your inflammatory system is on fire and shooting inflammatory cytokines all through your body, and your stress system is your friend. It is good to have a stress system. This is the basic biology of the fight or flight syndrome. So if you want to go back in evolutionary biology, it's what meant that when the woolly mammoth was coming at you, you didn't stop to analyze the situation. You just you ran or you prepared yourself to fight. And so all of these things are preparing your body for wound healing and fighting infection and maximizing your physical strength, all of those things. So it's good. Every animal species has a stress response system. It is good. It is meant to deal with an acute threat. Okay? It was not meant to deal with chronic threat or chronic stress. And so the high idea is that it gets ramped up, you deal with the threat, and then it goes back to baseline. And when it doesn't go back to baseline, and if it's ramped up most of the time, these systems that normally are kind of in an acute situation, gearing you up for protection, start to have a wear and tear effect on the body. They literally start to wear the body down. People describe it as a weathering process, and in fact it accelerates aging. And so not only does it disrupt brain circuits, and by the way, the parts of the brain most vulnerable are the hippocampus, which is where the simple memory and early learning circuitry is made, and the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the brain that's involved in executive function and self-regulation, like following their instructions, problem solving, and paying attention, and organizing yourself, all of those things that are critical for effective learning in the classroom, and not a matter just of how motivated you are, it's how well those systems are working. And just incidentally, School of Education, maybe not a medical school, but it also, the same systems accelerate atherosclerosis, they increase insulin resistance, and make you more vulnerable to get diabetes, make you more likely to have hypertension and stroke decades and decades later from these biological residuals. But the problem is that stress in this environment, and particularly as a policy issue, is a loser of a campaign. Nobody has sympathy for the stress problems in this society. This society thrives on overcoming stress. Right? And the political culture says, you're stressed, suck it up and get over it. You'll be stronger. This is what made this country great. Don't expect people to help you out. This is character building. So you can't go to a legislature or an executive branch and say, it's too much stress on young children, we need programs to reduce stress. People say, that's the family's job, not the public's job. And besides which, you want to talk about stress, you should hear what my day said. So it's a loser. So what we did is we went into the science and we realized that there's stress and there's stress. So we developed this very simple 3-category way of thinking about stress from a scientific point of view, thinking about the stress response. So the first is positive stress. There is such a thing as positive stress. A young child who experiences no stress is in trouble. Positive stress is the stress of the first day in the child care center, having to share your toys, having to go in for a nap and then want to miss what's going on, not being allowed to eat all of the Halloween candy that we collected. That activates the stress system of a 3-year-old or 4-year-old, but it's a brief activation because adults help the child learn how to develop the ability to cope with disappointment or stress. So behaviorally, you're learning how to develop adaptive skills, and physiologically, your stress system is learning to ramp up and then go back to baseline, protecting all of your organs, including your brain. Next category we call tolerable stress. I'll hold off for a second and then maybe put homelessness, but certainly it is not in the positive stress category. So tolerable stress is the kind of stress associated with things that could be threatening, like the stress of the death of a family member or serious illness or injury, or the stress of being a survivor of a natural disaster like Hurricane Katrina or the earthquake in Haiti or the tsunami in Japan, or the stress of being a survivor of an act of severe violence or terrorism, where we always ask the question of which kids are going to be okay and who's going to end up with problems, like who's going to end up with variations of post-traumatic stress disorder, who are the kids who are going to get by, all right? And before any science studied this, we instinctively, as a species, kind of figured out that what you do in times of stress is you help children feel safe. You bring them closer. You depending upon where they are developmentally, even if you never took Psych 101, okay, you try to help the child understand, and you help the child feel safe, and you provide that protection to get through. And kids can get through all kinds of horrendous experiences without residual, if there are adults who help them to cope and to feel safe. And what's happening physiologically when there's that secure response is the stress system is coming back to baseline. Which leads us to what we call toxic stress, which is the continuous, excessive, prolonged activation of the stress response system. I don't mean like a bad day. I don't mean like a bad couple of days. I mean as a chronic condition of one's life where the stress system is working overtime and there are not consistent, stable, protective adult relationships to kind of help a child feel safe and develop the ability to adapt and cope with stresses. So what it means is these are the most common precipitants of toxic stress, so like chronic physical abuse or chronic or prolonged neglect or chronic exposure to violence without anyone to kind of help you consistently feel safe in that environment. And so is homelessness, if homelessness, would that fall into the tolerable or the toxic category? You can all answer that question. It's like kids can get through. Obviously, the answer here is to not have children homeless and families homeless. In the same way that the answer to most of the problems we're dealing with would be satisfied by an end to poverty and discrimination and violence. We could close down a lot of programs now. Okay? But in the meantime, while we're waiting for poverty and racism to be eliminated, what could we do to protect children and increase their likelihood of having healthier outcomes and more effective educational achievement? Is to provide the kind of stable, supportive relationships through these difficult circumstances. So this is where homelessness becomes a toss-up between tolerable and toxic stress, depending upon, and it doesn't just have to be a parent. It could be any combination of adults who provide what children need to get through that. But obviously, this is a huge challenge. So the summary of these last several slides is that early life experiences are literally built into our bodies, for better or for worse. And that what we know from decades of research, both before from Neurons to Neighborhoods and since, all coming to the same conclusion is that stable and supportive relationships, language-rich environments, and mutually responsive interactions promote healthy brain development and also adaptive metabolic regulatory systems. And that accessible, prolonged activation of the stress response system in the absence of protective relationships can weaken brain architecture and disrupt the development of other organ systems. So I want to finish now by talking a little bit about, so how do we use this science to kind of answer the question of how do we improve the impacts of the policies and programs that we have. I mean, I will tell you from my perspective, just getting money for programs that are really struggling to survive right now, which by itself is critically important, is not the promised land. And science has a lot to offer now. It's great to be in a place like Lesley and studying the things you're studying, right? You are not learning what you learned and go out and just keep the money going for programs that people have been providing for years, even as effective as they are. You're here to learn how to move this field to a new place, to kind of be part of creating the future for early childhood. And there are really three agendas, there are three strategies that are kind of, I think, fairly prominent right now. The first is the need to enhance the quality of services that are provided and increase access. And a lot of people are working on that. It's very important. There's too much variability in quality at this stage of the game. The second is to figure out how to take to scale programs that have been shown to work in demonstration projects. There are people working on that. The third is an area where there hasn't been as much work. It's where we've been rolling up our sleeves and jumping in, is to kind of figure out how to build, test, and promote new theories of change. Not instead of what we're doing, but on top of what we're doing to enhance it. To answer the question of how do we move the field into a new era. So we're not just doing refinements of Great Society programs, as good as they are, but are not the final answer. So I'm going to just in 2 slides now summarize for you a lot of the thinking that's going on in our center now and just alert you. So everything up until this point was telling you what we know from science. The last few minutes, everything I'm telling you is kind of what we're thinking. We could be right, we could be wrong. But it's just that I moved from saying, so we need some new ideas, to say, take a chance, go out on a plank and say, we need some new ideas, and here's some of the new things that we're thinking about. But none of these things have been developed and tested yet, but they're meant to stimulate new thinking, rather than to just say, let's just refine the quality standards and move forward. So the current conceptual framework that's guiding pretty much all of our policies and programs for early childhood, including programs for children who are homeless, are based on this notion that some combination of parenting education, providing information and advice to parents, assuring sound nutrition, providing stimulating experiences for children, often in center-based programs, and a health-promoting environment, get the lead out of the paint that the kids are eating, and basically, and also there's a much greater attention now to have the community features like, is there access to healthy food, are there places to exercise, are there safe places for people to get through. All of these features, we understand, make for an environment that produces healthy developmental trajectories. But here's the problem. For many children, this is kind of very successful. I mean, for many children, their families provided without extra help. And for those families who need extra help, sometimes this extra help is the way we do it right now makes a difference. But there is a part of the population that is dealing with such significant adversity that just providing information to parents and encouraging people to talk to their kids more and read to their kids more and providing a good center-based program is not enough to overcome the magnitude of adversity associated with violence, serious neglect, mental illness, and really severe poverty that makes it very difficult for a family to be focused on anything other than just survival, getting on from day to day. When you're focused on whether there's going to be food on the table or whether you're going to not have a roof over your head, which is the theme of this conference, it's hard to kind of spend a lot of energy and time focusing on creating a well-organized kind of environment with a lot of rich learning opportunities during the day. So, and this, by the way, is a disproportionate part of the early childhood population that doesn't come to programs or drops out. This is the high percentage of the attrition group when we study programs, or families that are basically seen as hard to reach because we're not really providing what they need. So where our thinking is going right now is that we need a more balanced approach here, that the enrichment model, the kind of information model, the information transmission, the educational model, in some cases is not enough, and it needs to be balanced with protection So we take the same features that make up the enrichment dimension and the information education dimension. And what's missing is the creation of some new protective interventions that will provide a buffer against the significant adversity that will allow the healthy developmental trajectory to continue. This is a hypothesis, it's a theory. If you ask me, so what does the program look like? We're working on figuring out what that should be. Give us a little time. We just started thinking about this not that long ago. But we're actually working very hard with some fantastic people from around the country on developing some models of things that we're going to start testing in some community-based sites to see how they work. So here's what we're thinking about. I'm really putting myself out here. So where did you come up with that? Where are the data? If anybody wants to know where are the data, the answer is I have absolutely no data. In fact, on one of these things, there's no data in the literature, which is very surprising. So we started to think about, so what kind of strategies could we develop to help to improve life outcomes for kids? And so we're equally focused on two things here, reducing barriers to learning and also promoting and building strong foundations for health, because in both cases the science tells us that toxic stress is undermining learning because of its effect on brain circuits, and it's increasing the likelihood for poor health because of its impact on other organ systems. So right now, the kind of things we do, which make a difference, don't let anybody tell you we've got tons of data to show how we can improve outcomes. So this is not starting from ground zero. This is building on strength. So our basic approaches to reducing barriers to learning are child-focused educational strategies. Center-based programs, with trained staff, language-rich curricula, kind of trying to enhance learning, focused on the children. And in the health area, it's healthcare. It's the medical home, again, focused on the child. It's the visit in the doctor's office. All that magical stuff, and you can do everything in 7 minutes. That's going to improve the child's health. I'm being sarcastic here. So the question is, so what could we do to strengthen the capacity to buffer kids against toxic stress? How could we design, and test new approaches to strengthen adult capacities to reduce or mitigate the impacts of toxic stress? So our theory is that, that both parents, in many cases, and service providers in many cases, because a lot of child care in this country is provided by people who pay very little, who don't have a lot of formal education. And many of whom we've had multiple studies coming out right now that the rates of depression among child care providers are in many cases as high as the rates of depression in the mothers whose children are coming to centers in low-income communities. So it's a secret. We don't like to talk about that, but the child care workforce is largely made up of people with limited education and low income. And there's nothing about having that job that necessarily makes you different from people in other low income jobs with less than a high school education or just a high school education. So we went back to the science and said, well, there are areas that are crying out for more attention. And most of these things we haven't been the first to discover. But we know that there's a high rate of mental health problems, particularly depression, among low-income mothers, and actually mothers across the political spectrum. And if we don't do something about improving that mental health, that's going to affect the ability to be responsive to children's needs and to kind of be giving them what they need. But there's also this very important area of self-regulatory skills and executive function, which are these areas in the prefrontal cortex that have to do with things like planning and attention, and focus, and being able to follow directions, and being able to organize yourself, and being able to inhibit impulsive behaviors. So here's the exciting part of this, in my mind. There's been a lot of attention just in the last 10 years, none of this before neurons to neighborhoods. I'm looking at social class differences in development of the prefrontal cortex and development of executive function skills. You all kind of, I think most of you know what executive function skills are. The simplifying model we use for this, it's like the air traffic control system in your brain. It's a thing that organizes and keeps things, brings things together, and is critical for effective learning. So the data are now very clear that social class differences in this part of the brain that is one of the sensitive areas to toxic stress start to appear in brain development before age 2. And differences in executive function and self-regulation skills. This is the marshmallow test. You know, stuff. Those differences start to appear around age 2. Not surprising, right? So we see it behaviorally and we see it in neuroimaging. So now I'm going to take you into an area where there's no research whatsoever. It's unbelievable that there's no research. So we've hypothesized that kids in preschool, and think about what it must be like living in a homeless situation and dealing with things like planning and intention and organization. And when you're dealing with that kind of uncertainty and disruption in your life. So let's play it out now. This is all hypothesis. Differences beginning at age 2. By the time you get to school at age 5 or 6, in the absence of an intervention that's really focusing on building these skills, you're even further behind. So you start school not just maybe with less kind of literacy grounding, but less ability to follow instructions, to pay attention, to focus your attention, to kind of sit still, to inhibit your impulses, to plan, all of these things. And now let's say, hypothetically, you don't have the greatest school experience. Okay? And so it's unlikely that your executive function skills are getting better over time in the absence of a good school experience. And then you get, maybe you graduate high school, maybe you don't, but you're not a success of the K-12 education system. And you get out of high school, and your likelihood of having a job that will require high-level executive function skills is pretty low. Okay? Or you may not have a job. And then, whoa, what do you know? Now you're a parent. So the question is, and what's the relationship? What does executive function have to do with parenting? The greatest challenge to the executive function system of all is to manage a home life with a young child in terms of planning, organization, responsiveness, problem solving. So we start to say, well, so what do we do? So how could we, and our answer to this is advice and information. We give out books. We say read to the child, talk to the child. And I'm hypothesizing now. We haven't found any literature. There's nothing that's studied executive function skills in adults with limited formal education. All we have is work on adults who've had brain injury in the prefrontal cortex, so we have rehab literature. And we have some work on working on intentional skills in college students with ADHD. Nothing on skill building in terms of self-regulation or executive function in adults with limited education. To me, that's a gold mine to go looking for the kinds of skills that if we could build those skills, if we had interventions to build those skills, they would not only enhance parenting and family life, but also be a very effective way of preparing people to be more employable. Because this is kind of what you need to kind of be effective in the workplace. No, this isn't on the radar screen in the early childhood field. We're going after this big time. It could turn out to be like, it sounded good, but nothing happened. But I'm giving you an example of trying to think about new things above and beyond just saying maybe we need to refine the curriculum a little bit more, or maybe we should make 2 home visits a week instead of 1 with advice and encouragement about reading. So here's what's exciting about executive function as a thing to look at. So a lot of the basic skills in the brain have their circuitry pretty much developed within the early childhood period, and then it's over. The sensitive period is over, the plasticity is really dropped. Prefrontal cortex has the longest period of plasticity. It starts, executive function skills start in early childhood, as I said, before age 2. This is a period of rapid increase in the development of executive function skills. They continue to increase for a while, but then in adolescence and early adult life, there's another upslope. This is the stuff we used to mostly focus on. This is the part where we say in adolescence and young adulthood, you have that accelerated development in the prefrontal cortex, where it's things like judgment and wisdom and things like that, but it's also a lot of these planning skills. So here are 2 areas, one for the children and one for their parents, age 15 to 25. Where there's a lot of plasticity in the brain for these kinds of skills. And we're just providing didactic education in that area, and not building skills at a time when these skills are still malleable and are critical for both employability and for parenting. So it's a very exciting area to think about. So I'll end by just kind of walking you backwards and forwards through a logic model of how to take the science and apply it to policy and practice. So the goal here is health and development across the lifespan. And what we have is a very rich science now about the balance between biological adaptations and biological disruptions. How, the question is brain circuitry being built in a strong way, or is it disruptive? Is the cardiovascular system being built in a healthy way, or is it having premature atherosclerosis developing in childhood? Well, all of this is about gene-environment interaction. None of this is fixed genetically. Human Genome Project knocked that one out of the ballpark. None of the stuff we're talking about is hardwired genetically in a way that isn't influenced heavily by experiments. Very much influenced by experiments. And we also know from decades and decades of research, 3 areas that are ripe to be thought of as the foundations of healthy development that are made for physiological adaptation. It's the importance of relationships, it's the importance of the physical environment that children live in, its safety and its educational features, and good nutrition. Just those 3 areas are enough to really dig deep into and make a huge difference. How do we make a difference? By building the capacities of caregivers and communities to strengthen those foundations. So this means people need knowledge for sure. They also have to have capacities and skills. They need to be families need to have the financial resources to have a roof over their head, to put food on the table. Programs need to have the resources to provide the support that people need. Communities need to have the know-how to organize themselves to provide support for families. And this is where programs and policies become levers to do this. And it's not just early care education and primary health care. It's just about every policy dimension you can think of. You could put an early childhood lens through it, and you could even put a homelessness through it. So to what extent are the zoning regulations promoting healthy development for children? To what extent are the zoning regulations controlling how many places there are in the community that serve healthy food as opposed to fast foods and alcohol shops? How much open space is there where people can go and where parents can meet other parents and interact with each other and build relationships? How safe is it? How are these things? Housing policies, zoning policies, child welfare system. The child welfare system is built on state-of-the-art late 19th, early 20th century science. And that's, I don't mean that to be critical, because there are a lot of wonderful people where it's very hard to change systems. But with everything I've said, how could we have a child welfare system in 2011 that is focused essentially on physical safety and custody? And then this story. That spends all its money on I'm a pediatrician. I'm not going to say pediatrics is important. If you go to the pediatric meetings, the new things in child abuse and neglect are the new fancy technologies for brain imaging to be able to document a head injury. And where's the attention to kind of building and addressing other factors, like the idea that when you take children and move them from one home to another, you're activating the stress system, even though you may be taking them out of a dangerous environment and putting them in a safe environment. So every system could benefit, and it's not just public policies. You do not need a law for a business, a workplace, to decide it's going to make it easy for people to breastfeed. You don't need a law to say you have to provide some kind of wage replacement and provide some reasonable maternity leave. You can do that. There's no law against it. Well, it's a requirement some businesses do, but you don't need a law to do that. You don't need a law to say you should have some flexible time so someone can go and visit a child's preschool program and see a play and not lose a day. So if we look at this going back the other way, this is the way it works. The policies and programs, the way they work is not by magic. They need to focus on building the capacities of caregivers and communities to be able to build the healthy foundations of development, relationships. That's why turnover in child care centers is not just an administrative headache and costly. It activates the stress response system of every kid in the program when the person you know suddenly isn't there anymore, the new person. And those foundations will then result in biological adaptations that will produce effective learning and effective health. So this is my final take-home message for you. If you want to take one message from the entire presentation, this concept that you need to be more explicit about step 2. So I would say, kind of step 1, the equations on the left side of the board are, there are a whole lot of, we have all these lists of risk factors, of which homelessness is an increasingly important one, that we know lead to bad outcomes at the other way. And the question is, could we be a little bit more explicit about step 2? So what is it about these risk factors that produce poor outcomes? Because if we can't explain the connection, how do we know what to do? And the same thing for programs. We say we have programs, and we say, well, you know, we provide home visiting, and we provide Saturdays program, and we produce good outcomes. Look at this, and we do. But if we can't be more explicit about step 2, what is it about this program that makes a difference? And what is it about this program that is making more of a difference for some kinds of kids and not others? And what is it about this program that's missing that explains why for some of the kids and families we serve, we're not having a big enough impact? And how could better scientific understanding lead to enhancing our programs, enhancing our impacts by understanding better what it is about adversity that produces poor outcomes? So my take-home message for you is the entire field of early childhood policy and practice, including all of our work on homelessness, has to start getting increasingly more explicit about step 2 so we can know where we go next. This is our website. If you want, we have a lot of material on the website that makes the science, very sophisticated science, understandable to non-scientists. Our primary target audience is policymakers, and I welcome you to check some of this stuff out. I'm sorry if I ran a little bit over, but thank you very much.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Hi everyone. I'm Nancy Carlson-Page, and I'm here at Lesley. Thank you. This is so awkward. Now I want to talk to you. You have the wire. But thank you so much, Jack Shonkoff, for being here with us today and enlightening us about. I think I'm probably all right. Thanks. I'll come and get it if I feel like I need it. But it was a very helpful talk, and your work, you know, over the years has been extraordinarily helpful to all of us in the early childhood community who struggle to improve our efforts to provide good environments and promote well-being. And the science that you've done and your contributions to the literature have made such a difference. So I know you have a lot of admirers here in this room, people coming from many different disciplines and workplaces. The things, I want to say a few things first and give people a chance for question and answer. My comments will, you know, reflect my perspective and my experience as an early childhood educator. So they're of a particular view on what you're saying, though. So much of what you said, I'm in complete agreement with probably everything if I understood everything. But okay, so we're going to get a little PowerPoint going here. You know, one of the overarching ideas that comes through here is the lack of coordination of science of early childhood with public policy and practice. That, to me, that's my big idea, really, from a lot of what you contribute is, you know, how can we know all of this early childhood science and still be developing policies, even at this very moment, that are disconnected from that. So, okay, I am still trying to lower the child poverty rate. So, you know, my first graph is to remind us, first of all, in 2007, the child poverty rate in this country was 23%. We have the highest child poverty rate among wealthy nations. It's rising. A study I saw just recently said 1 in 4 children at this point are living in poverty in this country. And that's shameful. This is the wealthiest nation in the world, and 1/4 of our kids, or close to it, are living in poverty. And what this graph shows you is that even after government transfers, like tax programs or housing subsidies or child care subsidies, we're still having the highest child poverty rate among wealthy nations. So we're not, even though other countries have poverty, they have many more family and child welfare programs and housing programs and all kinds of things that prevent the sort of stress that Jeff is talking about. Okay. So I'll just read you a quote from Nelson Mandela, okay? There can be no keener revelation of a society's soul than the way in which it treats its children. So, you know, you've really enlightened us about the critical importance of the first years of life, the first 5 years of life, and the importance of healthy environments and nurturing relationships for promoting well-being and preventing the kind of stress that Jack is talking about. So it's phenomenal that only 4 countries in the world don't have nationally guaranteed parental leave programs when people have a new child. And you probably know the many countries, primarily in Europe, that pay parents for at least a year at home, often more. And we still have people who are talking in terms of weeks, if anything at all, when they have a new child. So just the idea that you would provide for society a stable relationship in infancy is, you know, a first step and something that we're still not doing. Along the same lines, the notion of high-quality, affordable childcare is essential. We have to have policies that provide for that. And in order to have that, what we have to have is a highly, highly trained early childhood professional workforce, which you recognize. And the thing is, there is a huge knowledge base in early childhood. It's phenomenal. If, you know, in the perfect world, if teachers were getting the kind of training and background they need to actually work with young children effectively and provide the kind of environment you're talking about, they'd have at least a master's degree. There's a very large knowledge base. Teachers have to understand the importance of play. Play isn't a frivolous thing that just goes on when kids are wasting their time. It's actually the core activity when cognitive and social and emotional concepts are developing, when children are developing self-regulation, these executive function skills, problem solving. Some of these skills develop naturally in play, but also the role of the teacher is really critical to intervene in ways that scaffold new learning that builds on play. It isn't just that children have a free-for-all, but at the same time, the heart of learning in the early years is active, it's physical, play-based, and activity-based. Also, early childhood teachers need to have a strong knowledge base in mental health, resilience, social and emotional development. I have file drawers full of drawings and descriptions of children in classrooms because I've been in early childhood classrooms for my whole career. This was a little 4-year-old girl who did this drawing and dictated, "This is what happens when you get shot," to her teacher. Early childhood teachers have to understand how to talk with children. First of all, to create environments where children feel safe enough to express what's going on in their lives, then to be able to talk with children and interact with children and provide an environment that enables a child to work through, it's often through play, what she's experienced, and to provide, you know, the sort of safety and sense of security and trusting relationships that are going to ameliorate the kinds of stress that arise in early childhood settings. So what's happening instead, which you realize, is that the opposite of what we need in terms of a well-paid, very well-prepared early childhood teaching force is happening. It's actually the early childhood teaching force of the cohorts of educators in different groups is the most fragmented, the most unstable, and the least well compensated. If you, there's a wonderful book, The Flat World in Education, by Linda Darling Hammond. She goes into a lot of explanation about how countries who are doing so well academically around the world are countries that have really dedicated themselves to raising the teaching profession, getting the standards up for teachers, providing access, college tuition for people who want to be teachers, devoting lots of government resources to professional development. And these are the things we need to do to get a teaching force that's going to be able to intervene in the ways that we need for children who are coming into settings who have all kinds of stress. The current policies we have in education, most recent ones, are they're not based in science at all. And since the passage of the No Child Left Behind legislation, we've seen an increasing focus on testing in the schools, a narrowing of the curriculum, less arts and less experience-based education. We've seen a disappearance, research tells us, of play in kindergartens around the country. And teachers, I am in contact with them all the time because I speak at conferences and travel and have contact with countless teachers who all say, early childhood teachers, they can't provide the kinds of curriculum they used to provide or that they know is needed because they're spending so much time on assessments and evaluating children. And that's been the whole thrust of the education reform, so to speak, policies now in place. But with the latest funding of Race to the Top, you may or may not know, it was focused on early childhood. But the requirement is that states have to put in place standards of learning for preschool children and assessments. I don't know if you're aware of that. So what that does is it puts the resources, states can get $100 million, but it's putting the bulk of the resources and the attention on evaluating what children know and testing it in various ways, assessing it. But it's putting the attention there rather than on children's needs, on understanding child development, on understanding each child, on building relationships, on meeting their needs, on creating a curriculum that lets them show what's happening in their lives. So the whole emphasis is wrong-headed. It's not based in any research at all. It's a big social experiment that's contributing to the harm in the sense that even those teachers who are capable of providing a less stressful environment for children are finding it a challenge. And the other danger is that because so many teachers are ill-prepared to be able to work in these early childhood environments, but now they have to impose standards and assessment, they're doing it with in the most isolated way, with the least context of whole child needs, if that makes sense. I have a lot of examples already of this, but not enough time to tell them to you, but some of them are pretty tragic about how these teachers are teaching the standards to little 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds now. So I think my time is up. I wanted to ask you about the media, since it's a special interest of mine, and I'd love to know your thoughts on it, but I know we're close to ending, so maybe I'll put that aside for another time. And although I just want to show you one slide. I can't help myself. But maybe I'll just end comments by talking to you about the mental health value of play. These children were in a kindergarten classroom the morning after the bombing of the federal building in Oklahoma City. They're not from Oklahoma. They heard about this television news, and they came into their kindergarten, began to build buildings and knock them down and pretend that they were dead. It took a very skilled teacher to know what to do in this situation. And children today are under more stress from exposure to all kinds of influences from media that they can't be protected from. Poor kids watch more and worse media, and they also are less supervised, and I think that's probably true of the homeless population. So that some of the trauma that early childhood teachers observe that kids bring into centers from having seen scary things in the media, because when they're little they don't separate fantasy and reality, so it's very scary. Those are, I think, an additional stress factor for many homeless children. So let's open this up now for comments and questions from you. Yes.
So I have no trouble believing that increasing skill building and executive functioning would contribute highly to increasing parents' abilities to build positive relationships with their children. I know very little about research and executive functioning, but I would imagine that the research that is being done at increasing rates in mindfulness would relate to this. You see the programs that are widespread now about mindfulness-based stress reduction developed by John Kabat-Zinn, and you see how, you take these monks who are meditating and they have elevated levels of brain functioning in their prefrontal cortex, and then you do this with people who are sick or in just very minimal stress. People who are in low stress situations, the high stress situations, they teach from basic mindfulness over time, and they have an increase in functioning in the prefrontal cortex. So that seems very logical to me, and it's amazing that there isn't more research on that, considering the growing field of mindfulness. But my question is how. If these services were to become available, how will you market it or get people to want to use the services? Because even if you have these amazing services, what motivates these people to use them?
You mean the kind of things that Jack's doing? What motivates people to want to use them?
So, is this working? Yeah. So I'll just give you my opinion. I don't have data on that. I've been spending more time recently with some of the behavioral economists who have been looking at new ways of understanding how incentives work and how people make the choices they make. And a lot of the work they're doing shows that people across social classes and independent of income make similar kinds of decisions, but just have fewer resources to work with. My sense of this issue of how do you get people to come? Very big question. Like two very simple-minded answers. One is, I got from them what they want. They're supposed to tell them what they need and then complain that they don't really care because they don't come, and maybe you ought to guess right what they need. And then when people don't come, or when they come and then stop coming, is, again, to go back to the drawing board, make this a co-created task rather than something that is answered by one side or the other. So I apply the same thing to practitioners and people who work in universities. So I think my sense is, and again, it's just an intuition, is that people who work on the ground in programs probably have a longer list of better ideas about things that are worth trying than people who sit in universities. But people who work on the ground don't know how to set up a study and don't know how to often measure kinds of things that will tell you whether what you're doing is making a difference. People in universities are very good, particularly the ones who get promoted instead, are very good at knowing what the next question is for the field, from a research point of view, and that's what fuels the next study. But they may not be very good at figuring out what the right question is or what to do in a particular situation where people don't seem to be interested in what's being offered. There's this new area of work in a family interview and motivational interviewing. So many of you are familiar with this, where basically, the data for some of these is really pretty striking. It shows something that has a big impact in just a few sessions, where the people who are receiving the service actually really driving what it is they're interested in getting help with. What they want to work on, and then you see returns. So I think this is not a barrier. It's not just science, policy, and practice, but it's on the ground. When I'm talking about developing some of these new ideas, we're focusing on trying to co-create them with people who are going to deliver them and the people who are going to receive them before we go out and get ready to test them. So I think it's just kind of getting everybody at the table.
On the mindfulness thing, there is research being done. There are teachers working with children, teaching mindfulness contemplative practices, they're calling them. It's very exciting, the power of it, and there's a program called Inner Resilience. You can look it up on the web. Dan Goldman has a book on this, working with children, NSCD, and it is a really powerful thing to start teaching young children as a way of handling stress. Yeah. Yes?
So we were having a discussion about this in a class on Monday, and it actually was something you mentioned sparked me, which was how we live in a day and age where it's all about how many, like in high school, you take these many extracurricular activities, you need to do this, that, and the third, and like the stress and anxiety that it places on these children who are their entire lives they're having to do as much stuff as they can so that they can have as much on their SATs once their SAT comes, and then so what's this research saying on developmental research on children based on just the overarching theme that you have to have as much as you possibly can in order to succeed in the future?
Yeah, it's a really important question. You know, I hardly ever give a presentation where some people don't come up afterwards and talk about how, oh God, they feel like maybe they're not providing enough of the right input for their kids. It's usually the best parents who kind of agonize the most. And you can't overdo this, obviously, right? I mean, there's some kids who are being provided so much enrichment it's making them crazy. So I think there's a balance issue here. It's not that enrichment by itself is good or bad. I think, first of all, there's an age issue here. There's a question about whether it's seen as remediation or enrichment, whether it's perceived as positive and pleasurable, or whether it's perceived as a burden, punishment. To me, that's the big issue there. But the big difference in terms from a policy perspective, this is really important. From a policy perspective, the casualties of kind of too much pressure or too much stress, the kids who grow in a privileged environment, is not as much of a cost to society because most of those kids are not going to end up in jail. And kids who are poor, who kind of are experiencing those kinds of circumstances, are very likely to be heading for economic failure, economic kind of non-self-sufficiency, and incarceration, which is always the biggest kind of cost issue for society. And that's where there are a lot of casualties among the privileged, but they don't end up costing as much money, and that's why it's more invisible. It's not that it is the problem. Good parents do lots of things wrong every day. Parenting is a much more art than it is a science. It's not
Yes.
I was wondering, do you have a target audience that you're looking for in the policymaking world, given that people on both sides of the aisle seem to be pushing what Dr. Carlson-Page talked about with Race to the Top and No Child Left Behind and everything, because it seems like it's coming from all directions.
So we're actually very intentional about our target audience. We made a decision about 8 years ago that we were going to have a state-based approach rather than a federally based approach, partly because I'm not doing it back in my against the law. And it's very hard. I mean, the federal system is very important in terms of money coming to the state. So I'm not saying it's not important to claim it, but we chose a state-based approach because at the state level, even though there's a lot of harsh partisan politics, at the end there are decisions that people have to make at the state level that make it less likely that everything ends up being gridlocked. We also partnered with the National Congress of State Legislatures and the National Government Association, getting to the point that the media, Nancy, is that we found that we actually, media is obviously a huge influence, and by working with NCSL and NGA, we had a direct pipeline right to the policymakers so they had to direct to them through the media. And our approach was to be fiercely nonpartisan. And if anything, we've done more work in conservative red states than we have in states that are big in government programs. And that's what got us into, where the new ideas, because we were surprised how relatively easy it was to just, if you start with the politics, it's the end, the conversation ends. If you start with, let's talk about government programs, it's like, it's over. But if you start with, let's talk about what we learned about brain development. I had an amazing experience in South Carolina with two people in the legislature who were fierce intelligent design advocates who were fascinated by the brain research because they saw it as evidence of intelligent design, which is kind of ironic because it comes from evolutionary biology. But for them, this was evidence of God's design that experience would shape your brain circuitry. So it was like, great. What's to argue with that? So, we said, so what they call intelligent design, science calls the variance left unexplained. And we could agree that experience affects brain development, and then we had work to do together, and it changed the nature of the conversation. So everything's about relationships, including policy. You can't affect policy by sending briefs to people. You have to build relationships like everything else, and then you can actually get a lot done. It's amazing how much you can get done.
There's working in the system and there's working outside the system. I don't think they contradict each other. I think it all has to happen. Yes. I think we'll take that one last question, then we'll have to end.
I'm wondering if you're familiar with the, there's a study or an article published in the Journal of Learning Disabilities from '92. It's
Oh, I know
about,
that paper. That was March,
right? But it was identifying alterable patterns in employment success for highly successful adults with learning disabilities.
What kind of patterns? You said what kind of patterns did you say?
Highly alterable. Alterable patterns in employment success for highly successful adults with learning disabilities. And it basically, it's something that I feel like you can kind of take that, with that research that's done, and kind of apply it to the general population. So employment success, a lot of it comes down to basically an individual's control, perceived control, and external, internal, external control. And it's something that I think one of the big things about the study is goodness of fit. So no matter whether you have a learning disability or not, if you're someone that's very creative and you're trying to make yourself do something that's very analytical, no matter what, you're not going to be as successful. So I mean, I think that's something that would be great if it was stressed along with the executive functioning aspect of it, but also to teach all students and all kids, do what you're good at, instead of kind of trying to shape our kids into something we want them to be, that they're not going to be successful in because it's not something they're good at or they want to do.
I got distracted because I was thinking to myself, wow, that's a long question. And I'm looking at my watch worrying about the time and wasn't concentrating deeply enough to be able to answer.
It's a good thing to end with. I mean, so for me, there's a good example of the fact that what wasn't said but was applied in the videos was that there are no perfect brains, and that all brains are different, and that there's a commonality and there's variability based on experience and based on genetics and experience and genetic. And so people have different things they're good at and different things they're not so good at. And obviously the key in life is to kind of find the niche that matches what you're good at. Which means that for some kids, surviving formal education that has less degrees of freedom is a problem, right? And particularly what's going on in this environment right now, and again, where science could be helpful and we'll brought to the table and make people listen, is that I didn't talk about how physical exercise promotes healthy brain storage. And in fact, how it really is a factor. As much as stimulation, physical exercise and oxygenation actually increases the vasculature of the brain. If we could get that information across, the first thing people would cut, physical education and art and music is the first thing to go. The budgets are tight. And somehow think that they're doing that in the service of enhancing more narrowly defined academic skills. So it's unfortunate that we provide so few degrees of freedom for kids to show varying talents in school. If you can survive and then find a niche, that's great. So your point is a good one, but this is your test. Right? This is your world, and there's a lot of good science to make that case.
Thanks for